The mirage of victory. Imagine you are a soldier in the summer of 1812. You are part of the Grand Armée. This is the greatest military force ever assembled in the history of the world. 600,000 men. They come from France, Italy, Germany, Poland, and Holland. You are led by a man who has never truly been defeated on a grand scale, Napoleon Bonaparte. As you cross the Niemen River into Russia, the sun is shining. The brass on the helmets is gleaming. The drums are beating a rhythm of certain victory. You think this will be over in 20 days. You think you will march to the border, fight one big battle, and the Tsar will beg for peace. But as you march deeper into the Russian heartland, something feels wrong. The air is still, the villages are empty, and on the horizon, all you see is smoke. This is the beginning of the end. Today we are covering the most harrowing military disaster in human history. Napoleon's army trapped in the Russian winter. The scored earth and the heat. Before we get to the snow, we have to talk about the heat. People forget that the Russian summer can be brutal. As Napoleon pushed forward, the Russians did something radical. They didn't fight. They just ran. But as they ran, they burned everything. They burned the wheat fields. They poisoned the wells. They slaughtered the livestock. Napoleon's army was built to live off the land. They didn't carry enough food for months because they expected to find it in Russian barns. But there were no barns. By the time the army reached the city of Smolensk, they had already lost 100,000 men to disease, heat stroke, and exhaustion. And they hadn't even fought a major battle yet. The Russian general, Barclay de Tolly, knew he couldn't beat Napoleon in a straight fight, so he used the land as a weapon. He used the distance. He used the dust. The Grand Armée was being swallowed by the sheer size of Russia. The bloodbath at Borodino. Finally, the Russians stood their ground. At a place called Borodino, just outside of Moscow, the two giants collided. This was the single bloodiest day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. 70,000 men fell in a single day. Napoleon won a technical victory, but it was a hollow one. The Russian army wasn't destroyed. They retreated in good order. Napoleon looked toward the horizon and saw the gilded domes of Moscow. He thought, "Finally, the war is over. I will sleep in the Kremlin, and the Tsar will sign the treaty." But when he entered Moscow, it was a ghost town. Almost every civilian was gone. And then, at midnight, the fires started. Russian saboteurs had stayed behind to burn their own capital to the ground. Napoleon sat in the Kremlin and watched his victory turn into a furnace. He waited for 5 weeks for a letter from the Tsar. It never came. The decision to retreat. By mid-October, Napoleon realized he was in a trap. He couldn't stay in a burned-out city with no food for the winter. He gave the order to turn around. At first, the retreat was orderly. The soldiers were loaded down with loot. They had gold, silver, and fine furs from Moscow. But they were slow, and the Russian army was now hunting them. They tried to take a southern route where there was more food, but the Russians blocked them at Maloyaroslavets. Napoleon was forced to go back the way he came, back through the lands they had already burned, back through the fields of Borodino, where the unburied bodies of their friends still lay on the ground. And then, on November 6th, the sky turned gray. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a few hours. The first snowflakes began to fall. The Russian winter had arrived. The White Death. This is where the horror truly begins. Imagine walking 20 miles a day in boots with holes in them. The temperature is 30 below zero. Your breath turns to ice on your mustache. If you sit down to rest for 5 minutes, you will never get up again. The horses were the first to go. Without food, they died by the thousands. When a horse fell, the soldiers would swarm it with knives, carving out meat before the animal was even dead. Without horses, they had to abandon the cannons. They had to abandon the wagons full of food. They even started throwing away the gold they stole from Moscow because it was too heavy to carry. Then came the Cossacks. These were Russian light cavalry who lived for the winter. They didn't fight head-on. They hovered like wolves on the edges of the columns. They would wait for a soldier to fall behind, then they would strike. The Grand Armée was being picked apart, piece by piece, by the cold and the blade. The crossing of the Berezina. The climax of this tragedy happened at the Berezina River. The bridge was gone. The Russian armies were closing in from 3 sides. Napoleon was cornered. It looked like the emperor himself would be captured. But his engineers did the impossible. They stood in the freezing, chest-deep water for hours, building 2 wooden bridges. Most of those engineers died of hypothermia within minutes of finishing their work. As the army started to cross, the Russians began shelling the bridges. Panic broke out. Thousands of people, soldiers, women, and children who had followed the army, were crushed in the rush or fell into the icy water. When the French finally burned the bridges to stop the Russians from following, thousands were left behind on the wrong side. The screams could be heard for miles. The ghost of an army. By the time the remnants of the army reached the border in December, they didn't look like soldiers. They looked like walking skeletons. Out of the 600,000 men who went in, only about 30 or 40,000 came out in any state to fight. Napoleon had already left. He took a fast carriage back to Paris to raise a new army, leaving his men to die in the snow. He famously said, "The sublime is only a step from the ridiculous." The Russian campaign didn't just destroy an army. It destroyed the myth of Napoleon. It showed the world that he could be beaten. It showed that nature and national spirit were stronger than any one man's ambition. The legacy of the snow. The retreat from Moscow remains the ultimate warning for any conqueror. It is a story of human endurance, but also of human waste. Years later, travelers in Russia would still find the bones of French soldiers and horses emerging from the mud every spring. The winter of 1812 changed the map of Europe forever. It led directly to Napoleon's exile and the rise of Russia as a world power. But for the men who were there, it was simply a nightmare of white and red, a nightmare of ice and blood. Thank you for staying with us through this epic tragedy. It is a story we must never forget, because it shows exactly what happens when pride meets the power of the earth itself. The psychology of the frozen. Imagine the mental state of a veteran of the Imperial Guard. You have fought in the deserts of Egypt. You have fought in the sun of Austerlitz. You believe you are invincible. But the Russian winter does something to the mind that a bullet never could. It strips away your humanity. Historians who studied the diaries of the survivors noticed a terrifying pattern. As the cold deepened, the social contract of the army began to dissolve. At first, soldiers would help their wounded comrades. They would share their meager rations of horse meat. But when the temperature hit 40 below, that changed. Men would see their best friends fall into the snow, and they wouldn't even look back. If a soldier had a warm coat, his own squad mates might wait for him to fall asleep so they could steal it. It became a war of every man for himself. The Grand Armée was no longer an army. It was a mass of thousands of individuals, all gripped by a primal, terrifying instinct to survive just one more hour. The death of the horses. We often talk about the soldiers, but we have to talk about the horses. Napoleon brought nearly 200,000 horses into Russia. These were the engines of his war machine. They pulled the cannons, they carried the supplies, they allowed the cavalry to scout. But horses need massive amounts of fodder, and in the burned-out wasteland of Russia, there was nothing for them to eat. They began to starve. When a horse is starving, it loses its ability to regulate its body temperature. The cold killed them by the thousands every single night. Without horses, the French were blind. They couldn't send out scouts because the Russian Cossacks would cut them down. They had to abandon their artillery. Think about that. The greatest artillery officer in history, Napoleon, was forced to leave his cannons in the mud because there were no animals left to pull them. The thunder of the empire was silenced by the lack of hay and the bite of the frost. The Cossack shadow. While the French were freezing, the Russians were in their element. Specifically, the Cossacks. These were irregular light horsemen from the southern steppes. To the French, they were like ghosts. The Cossacks didn't fight like European soldiers. They didn't stand in lines. They used hit-and-run tactics. They would appear out of a snowstorm, scream their war cries, spear a dozen Frenchmen with their long lances, and vanish before the French could even prime their muskets. They targeted the stragglers. If you were sick, or if your boots were worn out and you fell 100 yards behind the main column, you were a dead man. The fear of the Cossacks kept the French in a state of constant, grinding anxiety. You couldn't sleep. You couldn't forage for food. You were always looking over your shoulder for the shadow on the snow. The Hospital of Horrors in Vilnius. As the remnants of the army finally reached the city of Vilnius, they thought they were safe. They thought there would be food, beds, and medicine. But Vilnius became a graveyard. The soldiers were so hungry that when they finally found warehouses of grain and schnapps, they gorged themselves to death. Their bodies couldn't handle the sudden intake of food. Thousands died in the streets of the city from simple exhaustion and digestive failure. The hospitals were even worse. There were no doctors left. There was no firewood to heat the rooms. Frozen bodies were piled up in the hallways like cordwood. When the Russians finally took the city a few days later, they found thousands of French soldiers who had simply given up. They didn't even try to fight. They just sat in the dark, waiting for the end. The Emperor's Flight. On December 5th, at a place called Smorgoni, Napoleon made a fateful decision. He realized that if he stayed with the army, he would be captured or killed. And if he was captured, his enemies in Paris would start a coup. He called his marshals together. He told them he had to go back to France to raise a new army of 300,000 men. He got into a carriage, disguised himself, and drove west as fast as the horses could run. The soldiers he left behind felt a massive sense of betrayal. Their little corporal, The man they had bled for across an entire continent had abandoned them in their darkest hour. The morale of the remaining troops evaporated. Without Napoleon's presence, the retreat became a total rout. The men who were left were truly the lost souls of the empire. The General Winter legacy. Napoleon tried to blame his defeat entirely on the weather. He wanted the world to believe that no human could have beaten him, only General Winter. But history tells a different story. It wasn't just the cold, it was the Russian spirit. It was the scorched earth. It was the fact that Napoleon had underestimated the sheer scale of the land. He had tried to fight a 19th century war with 18th century logistics. When the news of the disaster reached Paris, London, and Berlin, the world changed overnight. The kings of Europe realized the giant was bleeding. They realized that Napoleon's invincible army was now buried under 6 feet of Russian snow. This was the moment the tide turned forever. The march to Moscow was the peak of his power, and the retreat was the beginning of his long walk to Waterloo. The final count. By the time the last few French soldiers crossed back over the Niemen River, they were unrecognizable. Marshal Ney, one of the bravest men in history, was allegedly the last Frenchman to leave Russian soil. He walked into a command post, covered in rags, his face blackened by campfires, and said, "I am the rear guard of the Grand Armée." Out of the 600,000 who marched in, only a fraction returned. A generation of young men from across Europe had been wiped out, not in a glorious battle, but in a miserable, freezing, starving crawl through the mud and snow. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the darkest chapter of the Napoleonic era. This story serves as a permanent reminder of the limits of power and the terrifying strength of the natural world.